Welcome to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to give you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Before we get started, I want to take a moment to talk to you guys about personal development. You see, if I've learned anything over the last 5 years of hosting this show, it's that the journey of self-improvement never ends. There's always a way to improve and grow. That's why my team and I have recently launched Superhuman Squad, an all-access pass to our full library of personal development courses. Think of it as the Netflix of personal development. For just $49 a month, you get access to each and every one of our premium courses, which sell for as much as $399 each. Best of all, you'll be the first to gain access to our new courses that we're developing in partnership with some of the most esteemed thought leaders we've ever hosted on the show. To get started, simply visit superhumanacademy.com. Greetings, SuperFriends, and welcome to this week's episode. Before we dive right into it, I want to thank Logo17 from the United States of America for an incredible 5-star review. And I quote, "Today, in an attempt to convince all of you to adopt Superhuman as a regular habit to enhance your life, I want to share a couple of reasons why I love this audio of wisdom. I firmly believe that when you stop learning, you stop growing, and that's when your inner self dies, so to speak." They go on to say, as someone who values productivity a lot, podcasts have dramatically increased the productivity of my life. Don't we all have these time-sucking tasks which we wish we could avoid? Well, Superhuman allowed me to heal my relationship with depression, helped me heal my relationship with overcoming anxiety. When you listen to this podcast, it's like sitting in the room and quietly listening to your heroes having a normal conversation together. Wow! Thank you so much, Logo17. I'm deeply moved by that review. I really, really appreciate it. And for those of you who have not left a review, please do, because it's ever so important to us and helps us get the absolute best guests on the show. Guests like today's guest, who is Nir Eyal, an author, speaker, and thought leader. Nir writes, consults, and teaches about the intersection of psychology, technology, and business. Actually, the MIT Technology Review dubbed him the prophet of habit-forming technology after his last book, Hooked, went supersonic and stellar and became a bestseller in pretty much every place you can imagine. By the way, many people don't realize, but Nir has actually also founded 2 tech companies since 2003. He's taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. And he's invested in a whole bunch of incredibly successful companies, ranging from Worklife, Product Hunt, Refresh.io, and Eventbrite, in addition to many, many more. You've also probably seen his writing in the Harvard Business Review, Techcrunch, and Psychology Today. Whew. Okay, so why have someone who's an expert in technology and habit-forming technology at that on the show? Well, actually, Nir and I have intersecting interests besides the fact that we are both children of Israelis and Hebrew speakers at that. Nir has recently written an all-new book. It is called Indistractable: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. Now, as many of you already know by the time you've seen this, I recently invested a ton of time working with an expert in my life to create a digital Zen course and help people figure out how they can put control and controls back on their technology use and get their life in order, digitally speaking. So I was really excited to pick Nir's brain and learn more. I have to say that before we hopped on the interview, I asked Nir what would make this a huge success for you, and he had a really untraditional answer. Most guests like to say something like, well, if I get to talk about this subject that I'm passionate about and we have a good conversation, that'll be a win for me. Nir's answer was, if I blow your mind or completely change the way you see an aspect of life, that'll be a huge win for me. And I have to say, he did not disappoint. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was one of those conversations where I just kept looking at the clock and hoping that I wasn't running out of time, but realizing that I was. I could talk to Nir for many, many more hours, and I hope to get the opportunity to do so. So, without any further ado, let me present to you Nir Eyal. Mr. Nir Eyal, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on the show, Jonathan.
It is an absolute pleasure. I know our paths have crossed a few different times, and I've actually been to some of your lectures and workshops, and really interested in all that you do. I find that the further along in life I go, the more psychology becomes a part of whatever it is I'm doing. So I'm really excited to pick your brain today.
Well, bravo to you for getting to the root of why people do what they do, right? It's so easy to stay with the surface level observations of how people behave, but that's what's always fascinated me about studying consumer psychology and interpersonal psychology is you can learn a lot of secrets that drive our behavior by understanding people's deeper psychology.
Absolutely. Now, one thing I've never had the chance to ask you, so I'm excited to get to ask you is, how did you go down this path? I mean, it's a very specific thing to get into psychology, and specifically you're in psychology of habits. Mm-hmm. What motivated you to start down this path?
Yeah, so let's see. So back in 2012, I had just finished the acquisition of a company that I had helped start. And this company was at the intersection of gaming and advertising. And we had watched, this was when Facebook was really kind of getting its ramp phase, and a lot of companies like Twitter and WhatsApp and Slack and Snapchat and all these companies kind of came out around the same period of time. And we watched them all grow in Silicon Valley where I was based. And, there were a lot of hits and a lot of misses, and there wasn't really a science to why some products succeeded and others failed. And so I kind of had this front row seat to watch these companies come and go. And I had a hypothesis after my last company was acquired. I had a hypothesis that habits would really matter, that the products and services that can create user habits are the ones that would be the most important companies of the next foreseeable future. But I didn't find any book on how to build those type of companies, how to build what I wanted to do, which was healthy habits, right? We have a lot of companies out there that maybe use our habits for nefarious purposes, or maybe just time wasters like, gaming or social media. Not that they're bad necessarily, but I wanted to really see if we could use these same principles for good. And so I wrote Hooked, which is about how to build habit-forming products. And that's been about 5 years since Hooked was published. And I originally started publishing it, actually, what I was learning for myself, right? I just wanted to learn for myself how to build these kind of products, but didn't find the book that I was looking for. So I decided to write it myself. And that turned into a course that I taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and at the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design. Then I started to have this other revelation that, what had started as a way to figure out how to build healthy habits, I realized can also have some detrimental effects, and that I was noticing that in my own life, I was using some products and services too much, right? That I was overindulging sometimes. And I think that's the problem that we hear about these days is that, there are so many good technologies, so many interesting things to do with our time that it's hard to get anything done. And so I started to explore this question of how do we become what I call indistractable? How do we do what we say we're going to do? That's kind of what brings me here.
I love that. And, it is interesting because your book is held up a lot of times as, the good guys and the bad guys. Not that there are good guys or bad guys, but the folks building the products that we probably shouldn't be using, they're reading your book as much as anyone else. And so I think it's, so important that we take it into our own hands, because we can't be sure, who is going to be building these products that are going to be so incredibly habit forming.
Yeah. And there's, to some degree, I started from that perspective of, I remember this one instance where I was playing with my daughter, and we had this afternoon together, and we had this book of activities that daddies and daughters could play together. And, it's fold a paper airplane and do this and do, different activities. And one of the activities in the book was to ask each other this question. And this is very appropriate to the theme of your podcast, right? The question was, if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? Mm-hmm. And I remember this question because, I remember my daughter asking me this question. I don't remember her answer because in that moment, I wasn't fully present. I was using my device. I was looking at a screen, and I had gotten distracted. And next thing I knew, I looked up and my daughter had left the room. She was gone, and I had blown it. I had blown this perfect moment. I'd done something that I didn't want to do, and I regretted it. And so I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm the guy who wrote Hooked. I understand the deeper psychology of how these products are designed to get you hooked. And yet here I am, hooked myself in an unhealthy way. I mean, I wrote hooked. I didn't write hooked for Facebook and Google. Let me be very clear. They have known these techniques for decades, right? They know these techniques very well. I use them as the case studies for how the rest of us, anybody in business, can use these same techniques for good. However, despite knowing how these products are built, I realized that I didn't have the toolkit, the skills that I needed to fight distraction. And so that was really the moment in time when I said, wow, if I could have any superpower, if I were to answer this question from my daughter's book, if I could have any superpower, it would be the superpower to be indistractable, to be the kind of person who does what they say they're going to do. And originally I started writing the book thinking that I was going to write Unhooked. That was actually going to be the original title of the book. And the book was going to be kind of this anti-technology mea culpa around like, oh my gosh, this has gone too far. But then the more I started to explore this question of, is it really the technology doing it to us? The more I got historical references for how people have coped with distraction in the past, the more I understood the deeper psychology of distraction. I came to a very unconventional realization, which is, lo and behold, it's not the technology's fault. Mm-hmm. It's not the technology's responsibility. In fact, it's our responsibility. And the more I tried to do what every other expert, guru, and book said to do, of just get rid of the technology, right? Like go on a digital detox, do a 30-day, plan, the more I realized those things actually backfired. And here's why. So I used to be clinically obese at one point in my life. And I remember when I was obese that I would do all these fad diets because, again, I thought food was the problem. So, okay, I'm going to do a 30-day no fast food diet. And then guess what happened on day 31? I'd go crazy and, make up for lost time because I hadn't dealt with the reason why I was overeating, the reason why I had lost control over my behavior. And so that, the more I dug into the psychology of distraction, I thought the book would be about, why technology is bad for us. And really what I figured out was that this book is about the psychology of all distraction and technology. Technology can be a source of distraction, certainly, but a lot of things can be a source of distraction, right? The television, the average American spends 5 hours a day watching television. Your coworkers at work can be a distraction. Even doing positive things like, checking email sounds like that's a productive thing to do. But if what you had planned to do was work on a big project, well, then it's also a distraction. Right. So the central question of the book, and the reason I do think it's a superpower, is this question of how do I get myself to do what I know I should do? Right? Why don't we do what we say we're going to do? I mean, how amazing would our lives be if we did everything we know we should, right? We know how to lose weight, right? We know the basics, right? We know how to be productive. We know how to have good relationships. Oh, if you just sit for 5 minutes and ask yourself how, you'll figure it out. It's not rocket science. The question that remains is why don't we do the right thing despite the fact that we know what to do?
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you a tongue-in-cheek question before we dive into the actual how, which is to play devil's advocate. I think a lot of people out there go, well, a little distraction is normal and it's fine. I'm just multitasking. Like, what's the big deal with having all these different so-called distractions?
Right. So it depends how we define the term. I think it's actually a fantastic question. A lot of times we think we understand something, and then when we ask ourselves to define, well, what do we actually mean? We realize we have very squishy terms around what we actually mean by the words we use. And so I start the book by actually defining what is distraction. And so here's how I define distraction. Distraction is the opposite of traction. Traction and distraction. They both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. Okay. So traction are these are actions that we take that pull us towards what we want in life, right? Mm-hmm. They are things we do with intent. The opposite of the things we do with intent, the things that move us towards, that pull us towards what we want in life, are acts of distraction. Distraction is anything that we do that pulls us away from what we really want to do, away from our acts that we plan to do, these things that we plan to do with intent. So, you can imagine this as a number line. You've got traction to the right and distraction to the left. And both of them, you'll notice both words, traction and distraction, end in the same root, action. Reminding us that this isn't something that happens to us. A lot of people will say, I wanted to work on that big project, but my phone rang and I got distracted, right? I got distracted by my iPhone. But that's not exactly accurate. A distraction is the action you take, right? It's what you do in response to either external triggers or internal triggers. So this is the whole 4-part model that I based the book around. Is you've got traction to the right, distraction to the left, and then you've got 2 arrows pointing to the center of this number line, the top and bottom, is around internal triggers and external triggers. External is everything in our environment that tells us what to do next, and internal triggers are these uncomfortable sensations we seek to escape. And so right there, these 4 parts, internal triggers, external triggers, traction, distraction, you have everything that there is to know about how to do what you say you're going to do. So to answer your question about, well, isn't distraction a good thing? No, distraction is never a good thing. But it depends on what actions you define as traction or distraction. So let me give you an example. Many people would say, oh, social media, that's a distraction, right? Well, not necessarily. The time you plan to waste is not wasted time. So if you plan to take a nap, if you plan to scroll social media, watch YouTube, do whatever you want, that is not wasted time as long as you planned to do that thing, as long as you did it with intent, as opposed to letting the app maker or a colleague or whatever tell you what to do with your time, right? If you look back and you regret how you spent your time, well, you got distracted. So it's very, very important that we define these things. And so it's also particularly important because a lot of tech critics will create like a moral panic around these activities. Oh, Facebook's bad. Video games are bad, right? Instagram is bad, whatever it might be. And I think that's rubbish. It's all great. It's all fine if it's how you choose to spend your time as opposed to letting the app maker or the technology maker decide how you spend your time.
I love that. And I think it shows like how much time you've spent thinking about these things and how much weight you've put in, not just to the habits that these things are forming, but actually the ramifications behind them and to our productivity and you being an exceptionally productive person as well in your own investing and writing books and teaching, and you're juggling so very many things. So how do we do it? I mean, how do we be deliberate about this?
Yeah. So these are the 4 basic steps of how do we become indistractable. So the way we become indistractable, remember this mental picture that I'm trying to draw in your head and in your listener's head of to the right, you have a number line that goes, it points to traction. On the left is distraction. You have 2 arrows pointing into the center. One is internal triggers. One is external triggers. And now to become indistractable, we just make our way through these 4 parts. And it's important we do them in order. The most important step is the first step, which is to master these internal triggers. Now, this was a huge revelation for me because what I learned and what I didn't want to know, but turns out to be an inconvenient truth, is that distraction almost always starts from within. The icky, sticky, uncomfortable truth is that the reason we get distracted tends to be because we are trying to escape an uncomfortable emotional sensation that we don't know how to escape from in a healthier manner. Right. And so this, I hope, is one of these aha moments for folks. It certainly was for me because it's so easy to blame your boss, your colleagues, Facebook, YouTube, the news, Twitter, whatever it is, something that got you distracted without asking yourself, why did I get distracted? And so to understand this question of why did I get distracted, we have to start with a base understanding of why do we do anything? Right? Let's really look at first principles here. What is the root of motivation? It turns out the root of all human motivation is not what we used to think. Most people think of this pleasure principle, that what Freud called the pleasure principle, that everything we do is a desire to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, right? That seems kind of common sense, carrot stick, right? Turns out that's not true. That Freud's pleasure principle is incorrect. That neurologically speaking, it's not the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. It's actually all pain. The reason we do anything at all, is a desire to escape an uncomfortable sensation. Now, those sensations can come from physiological responses. This is called the homeostatic response. For example, if you go outside and it's cold, well, you put on a coat. That doesn't feel comfortable, so you put on a coat. If you walk back in after you've been outside, now it's too hot. That's uncomfortable. You take it off. If you're hungry, you feel hunger pangs, you eat. If you feel full, you're stuffed, that doesn't feel good, you stop eating. So those are physiological responses, right? The brain gets us to take physical actions when our body is outside of a range, and that's called the homeostatic response. The same thing occurs psychologically. So psychologically speaking, think about why do we really use the products we use? And this came out of my research in writing Hooked. If you are lonely, well, what app or website do you check? You check Facebook or Tinder or whatever else. Yeah, exactly.
Depends what kind of lonely, I suppose.
Exactly. Different flavors of loneliness. Right. Exactly. If you are feeling uncertain about something, before we scan the brain to see if you know the answer to something, you're already Googling it. And if you're bored, you might check YouTube or Reddit or sports scores or the news. Lots of different products cater to this internal trigger of boredom. So the conclusion here is that if all behavior is motivated by a desire to escape discomfort, that means that fundamentally time management is pain management.
Wow.
We have to understand why we are trying to escape the thing we know we should do, because we are trying to escape some kind of uncomfortable sensation. So this is the most important step, is mastering these internal triggers.
Wow.
I'll pause there for a minute.
That's fascinating. And it's beautiful because it's simplifying. It's just figuring out, if I understand where you're going, it's figuring out, why am I uncomfortable? Why do I want to browse Instagram right now instead of doing what I need to do, and getting to the actual core of that?
Exactly. And so there's two things you can do about that. And so I'm condensing a lot of what's in the book, but essentially we only have two choices, right? So if we understand that all our behavior is motivated by a desire to escape discomfort, what do we do about that discomfort? Well, there's only two things we can do about it. We can either fix the source of the problem, or we can learn techniques to cope with that discomfort. And so I talk about in the book, a big chunk of the book is this idea of, why are we so uncomfortable, particularly in a place where most people spend their days, which is in the workplace. And it turns out, this was probably my favorite section of the book in terms of the research that I conducted here, was digging into this fact that we know that there are two conditions in the workplace that literally cause depression and anxiety disorder. Not just correlated, they have been shown to cause anxiety and depression disorder. And so what we have is many workplace cultures which perpetuate these two conditions. These two conditions are environments that have low control and high expectations. And in the confluence of those two cultural elements, you get situations where people are burdened with this psychological discomfort. And of course, what would they do with that psychological discomfort? They look for escape. They use distractions to make them feel better. And so this is why I say in the book that distraction in the workplace is a symptom of a dysfunctional company culture. It's not the technology per se. Technology is the tool. But what we find is in organizations that have a sick, unhealthy company culture, people are sending more emails. They're on Slack channels constantly. They're calling more meetings because they're doing this stuff to make them feel better, like they're in control when really they're not. And so there's some really interesting deep psychology around what causes these internal triggers. And of course, I give you some prescriptions for how to potentially fix it.
Right. I was going to say, I'm coming to accept the fact that I'm barely going to be able to scratch the surface with this interview, because there really is quite a bit here. This episode is brought to you by Ambronite. Ambronite's plant-based meal replacement shakes are made of 100% real foods. They have everything you need and contain zero preservatives, GMOs, or artificial BS. I recently got a shipment of Ambronite, and I have to say, I am pretty impressed. The product blends ridiculously well. It tastes great, not too sweet, and not like grass clippings either. And it actually keeps me satiated for 4+ hours. So this is one product that I will be carrying in my travel bag, putting in my desks, and placing in my kitchen cabinet. Now, to go ahead and get 10% off of Ambronite's complete meal and balanced meal shakes, visit ambronite.com/superhuman and make sure to use the coupon code superhuman at checkout. That's ambronite.com/superhuman and use coupon code superhuman at checkout. Give me some practical things that people can do today while, they're waiting for, I don't know if anyone still buys paper books, but say they pick up a copy of the book and they're waiting for it to come. And I mean, I guess now with Amazon, talk about a habit-forming product, it'll arrive same day. But in the hour before the paperback actually shows up, what are some things people can do right away to start becoming, and I love this term, I'm totally going to quote you on this, indistractable?
Right. So there's so much you can do. There's so much you can do. I don't know where to start. You know what? Maybe let's do this. Let me walk you through the 4 steps. And then we can dive deeper in the one that is most interesting to you. Or even better, maybe you can tell me about something that perhaps you struggle with, a distraction in your life, and then I can kind of help diagnose where you might want to focus first. How's that sound?
Either way, I'd love to hear about the 4 steps.
Okay, perfect. So the first step we just covered, and that's the most important step, is master the internal triggers. And the reason that's so important is because if we don't do that first, we'll always get distracted by something, right? So in my case, right, I believed what a lot of tech critics will tell you that, get rid of your cell phone, the digital detox, all that stuff. I got a flip phone from Alibaba that didn't have any apps on it. I got a word processor without an internet connection. I did all this stuff. I got rid of my technology. And it didn't work. And it didn't work because I was still feeling the internal triggers, right? I'd sit down to write. Writing is hard. It's boring. And so when I felt those negative emotional states, because I hadn't learned how to cope with that discomfort or fix the discomfort, I'd look behind me on my bookcase and say, oh, there's that book I've been meaning to read. Or, oh, you know what? My desk needs tidying up. Or the trash can needs emptying. And I constantly got distracted by something because I hadn't dealt with the deeper reasons, the internal triggers. So distraction is not a new problem, right? Socrates and Plato talked about the nature of akrasia, this tendency we have to do things against our better interests 2,500 years ago. So that's the most important first step.
That's comforting. If they experienced it, then the rest of us, we're probably okay.
To me, it was very comforting because this is part of the human condition. This is part of being a grown-up, right? Is the world is full of lots of distracting things. It always has been full of lots of distracting things. And it's not your fault that you live in such a world, but it's our responsibility. And it's not a new problem. Every generation has had this problem. So the next step, the second step after we've mastered these internal triggers, is to make time for traction. So remember we talked about traction to the right, distraction to the left. How do we make time for traction? Well, it turns out that in the research that I did for this book, it took me 5 years to write this book because I tried so many things that didn't work that I left out of the book. But in the course of writing this book, I worked with a lot of people trying different techniques. And one of the most common things I'd hear is people say to me, the world is so distracting these days. I can't get anything done between Twitter and Facebook and Trump and this and that, my boss, my kids. And I say, wow, that's really tough. Can I see what it is you plan to do today? Can you show me your calendar so I know what it is you got distracted from? And they sheepishly take out their calendar and they show it to me, and it's blank. So 2/3 of people out there do not keep a calendar. So here's the thing. Wow. You have no right to call something a distraction unless you can tell me what it distracted you from. Because if you don't plan your day, somebody else will. Right? Somebody is going to eat up that time. And that means you have to plan your day. So I actually have a free tool. I can give you a link for the show notes, a scheduling tool where you can actually make your own calendar template. And I mean, make that template down to the minute. If it takes you more than 15 minutes, it needs to be on your calendar. Here's why. Because you need to make time for your values. A lot of us talk a good game. I used to talk a good game and say, oh, yeah, I value my family above everything. My family is super important to me. But when you looked at my calendar, there was no time for family on my calendar. So who am I kidding here, right? Now, I'm not saying family needs to be important to you. I am totally fine with you saying, look, my career is more important than my family. That's fine. That's not for me to judge. That's for you to judge. But whatever your values are, you need to turn your values into time by making time on your calendar to do what you say you're going to do. And synchronize that time with the stakeholders in your life. So with your family, your friends, with your boss, with your colleagues, I show you how to synchronize that time so you're all on the same page. So that's step 2.
Love that.
Step 3 is about hacking back external triggers. So in Hooked, I talk about how product designers from Facebook and YouTube, Twitter, all these companies, how they hack our brains to get us to do what they want us to do, right? Well, here I tell you about how to hack back these external triggers, these things in our environment that tell us what to do. Now, some of those external triggers can lead us towards traction. So if an external trigger, your phone pings or dings and tells you, hey, it's time for that meeting, or if it's time to go work out, or whatever the case might be, well, that's leading you towards traction. That's something you plan to do. But if you have a ping or ding on your phone and it leads you to check your device like it did in my case when I planned to be with my daughter, well, now that's leading me towards distraction. So the critical question to ask here is this. For every external trigger in your life, whether it's your phone, your desktop, your work colleagues, whatever it might be, everything that might potentially trigger you, something in your environment, we've got to ask ourselves, is this trigger serving me or am I serving it? And I show you how, all of these distractions that we find are the most common distractions between your phone and your desktop and the open floor plan office and meetings and group chat. I go through every one of these potential environments to show you how to hack back the external triggers in all of these environments. So that's the third step, is to hack back external triggers. The fourth step is to prevent distraction with pacts. And in this case, a pact is a pre-commitment device. It's one of the best tools we know to make sure we do what we say we're going to do. But it has to come last. Because if you do it too soon, and many people have heard, one form or another of these pre-commitments, if you do it in the wrong way, or if you do it too soon, it backfires. It can backfire in a big, big way. So there's a word of caution there. So what is a pact? What is a pre-commitment? It's when we make a decision in advance to prevent us from doing the wrong thing later. And these pacts come in three forms. They can be an effort pact, a price pact, or an identity pact. So an effort pact is some kind of bit of work, some bit of effort that prevents us from doing something we don't want to do. For example, in my home, I have an outlet timer that turns off my screen and my internet router every night at 10 p.m. Okay. Now I can turn it back on, but it takes effort, right? It takes work for me to do that. So that's an effort pact. And I give you about a dozen other things you can do to create effort pacts in your life. Then there's a price pact where there's some kind of cost to doing what you don't want to do. And then finally, and most importantly, is what I call an identity pact. And this is probably something that your listeners can do right away. You asked earlier, what can we do right now in between when you get interested in this topic versus when you get the book, is to change how you view yourself. And this is something I learned from organized religion. When I was looking at the psychology of organized religion, we see that every major organized religion, I should say, has an element of proselytization, right? Whether it's Christians that want to convert more Christians, or Jews who want to bring more Jews back into the fold, or Muslims. Every religion wants to convert people. Well, why is that? Okay, part of the benefit is that it brings more people into the fold. But I'd argue the real reason that this is such a widespread practice is that by preaching to others, you are solidifying your own identity. And so by telling others what they should become, you solidify what you yourself think you should be. And so this is called an identity pact. And so I talk about in the book how we can cement our identity, because what I learned is that behavior change is identity change and vice versa. And so I tell you ways to change your identity. And this is why the book is titled Indestructible, is because I want this to be the new moniker around why people, why don't you answer your text messages right away? Oh, I'm Indistractable. Oh, well, why do you have that screen sign on your monitor that tells people you can't be bothered right now? Oh, I'm Indistractable, right? So the reason why I want people to use this moniker is because it helps them create an identity that binds them to what they really want to do. So that's just one of the many techniques. But the four big strategies are master the internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back external triggers, and prevent distraction with pacts. And each of those, of course, has a long list of tactics for how to execute those four strategies.
These are fantastic, Nir. And I think you'd get along. If you don't already know Dr. Benjamin Hardy, I think you two would get along really, really well, because I've started implementing actually some of this stuff because of my interactions with Ben. And he, albeit terms things a little differently, he calls pacts forcing functions. And he uses the term signaling for changing the identity that you believe. But we actually had him host a willpower challenge, not around technology, but more around eating the things you don't want to eat, or getting to the gym when you actually claim you want to get to the gym. And he hosted this challenge for 30 days with our private mastermind. And it's like changed my life. Like I've been waking up at 5:30 in the morning because I have a pact. And have you discovered the K-Safe, by the way?
Yes, absolutely. It's in the book as well. Absolutely. That's a great example of an effort pact, right? You could break this safe open and get your Oreo cookies out,
Right.
but that requires a lot of effort.
Exactly. And so you asked, like, what's one thing that I'm struggling with is I work from home many days. And oftentimes what I like to do is I'll pop open YouTube during lunch because there's no one here. And I'll watch like a TED Talk, or I really like this one channel, Wendover Productions. He like explains how things work, how global logistics work. It's kind of like, imagine like a little mini 10-minute documentary. But when I'm done having lunch, I should go back to work, and I end up just sitting on the couch for an hour and a half. And the K-Safe has been transformative because what I'll do is when I'm in a super high willpower state, like 5:30 in the morning, immediately when I wake up, I will put the remote in there and lock it for 18 hours. It's no longer an issue for me.
There you go. So that's a great example of a pre-commitment device. And these tactics have been around for ages. I mean, the first pre-commitment is the story of Ulysses. 2,500 years ago, Homer wrote about this story of Ulysses sailing past the island of the Sirens, and he binds himself to the mast of his ship so he won't crash his crew into the island of the Sirens. So these pre-commitments have been around for a very, very long time. They have different names, of course. The important thing here to remember, though, is that we don't want to jump the gun. I think where some people mess up is that they inflict one of these pre-commitments. You know, they take a price pact where they have some kind of monetary disincentive if they fall off the wagon, or they use one of these devices like a K-Safe. But again, if you haven't done the other 3 steps first, it can backfire because many people, if they haven't learned self-compassion, I talk about this in the book, why people who are self-compassionate actually are much more likely to accomplish their goals. Because what happens is we all invariably fail. On the path to becoming indistractable, being indistractable does not mean you never get distracted. It means you strive to do what you say you're going to do. And some people, when they fail, they take it really hard and they beat themselves up. And in that case, it can actually backfire unless you know the methodology for being compassionate to yourself. And first and foremost, dealing with those internal triggers. So my challenge to you would be, what is it that you're feeling when you are struggling to get off the couch, right? Why do you continue to procrastinate? And can you deal with that discomfort in a healthier manner? Now, part of that solution may also be a pre-commitment, but I would argue if you could tackle that, you wouldn't be so dependent on the K-Safe in the first place. So that's why it's important, I think, to go in order.
Totally. And you're absolutely right. It happens on those days when there is some element of discomfort working on a project that I don't want to work on, getting back into something that's particularly challenging. It never seems to happen when I'm excited about what I have to do for the rest of the day.
There you go. That's the insight. So the idea is, well, what do you do about that? Right? How do you create motivation, so to speak? And so I give 3 techniques in the book about how we can master these internal triggers, how we can see them differently. It literally requires us to reimagine our internal triggers. And that requires reimagining the internal trigger itself. It requires reimagining the task. And I give these techniques for how we can see the task itself differently so that we become more motivated to do it. And then finally, reimagining our temperament. And this is probably where I found the most misinformation out there when it comes to the science of willpower and motivation. Are you familiar with ego depletion, this idea that willpower is a limited resource? And so I'm not sure if you've discussed this previously on the show, but this is probably one of the most pernicious myths out there, this idea that willpower is something you tap out of. It turns out that's not true. It's only true if you believe it's true. And so this is why I think this book, it's fascinating stuff. So Carol Dweck, the author of Mindset, did these amazing studies that found that willpower, and this is why we have to stop spreading this myth, because we are literally hurting people. Here's what happens. This is what I used to do all the time. I'd say, I'd come home from a long day of work. I'd sit down on the couch. I'd start watching Netflix, and I'd start eating a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream because I deserved it. I was spent. Right? And it turns out that's not true, according to these studies conducted at Stanford by Carol Dweck, unless you believe it's true. And so this has some really profound implications, because what this means is if we believe this rubbish, that willpower is an expendable resource, we have an excuse to quit trying. And this is a really big deal. We also see this is what kind of blew my mind as well, is that this current narrative that technology is addictive, that it's hijacking your brain, that it's like drugs and dopamine squirts and all this stuff is not only is it scientifically not true, believing it makes it so. Right? So if we believe that technology is hijacking our brains and it's addicting us, we become less likely to do anything about it. It's called learned helplessness. And so we really have to fight this myth that we have somehow run out. And so this is called reimagining our temperament. And it's a really critical part of becoming indistractable.
That's interesting. Before we recorded this episode, I asked you what would make this a massive win for you. And you said if you managed to change my mind about something, it would be a massive win. And I think we're almost there. I think you changed my mind. I want to kick the tires of this a little bit because I learned about this whole willpower ego depletion thing because I studied sociology. And it's not the way most people think it is, but the way I was always taught it is first off, emotional labor will deplete your willpower. Meaning if you work in customer service and you get screamed at, that's more going to deplete your willpower than say making a bunch of decisions. So is that still a thing? And also, is decision fatigue still a thing, even if willpower depletion is not?
So it very well might be that when you learned about ego depletion, this was the latest cutting edge science. And what we've seen over the past few years is that there's this replication crisis. And unfortunately, the ego depletion hypothesis was caught up in this replication crisis in that the studies could not replicate. And so, many people have tried to replicate Roy Baumeister's studies around ego depletion, and it turns out they just can't find the same results occurring. Now, it still might exist, but it doesn't look good. From everything I've seen on the meta-analysis of this effect, it doesn't look like it's there.
Interesting.
Just to be very clear about what is ego depletion, it's the idea that we run out of this resource, that it's like a gas tank. And then once you're out of willpower, it's spent. The alternative hypothesis is that willpower is not a limited resource. It's an emotion. This comes from Michael Inslet. He says that, in fact, willpower is an emotion. So just in the same way we wouldn't say, oh, I was having a great time, but then I ran out of happy. Or I was really upset at you, but then I ran out of being sad. That's not the way emotions work. Unless, of course, you believe it's the way emotions work. So when it comes to willpower, it's really about changing our view of what we believe we are capable of, changing our perception of our own temperament, and not creating these self-limiting beliefs which unnecessarily cause us to quit.
This is really interesting.
Yeah, so instead of saying, okay, I'm spent, I'm done, right? That's the best I got, which I used to do, and make an excuse for why I deserved ice cream and Netflix. What we can do instead is to say, okay, you know what? I'm a little bit tired, but this passes. And so I give techniques in the book around how to use – I draw research from acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, where we can use these techniques to write out these negative sensations just in the same way we would write out any negative emotional response.
Wow. Okay. This is, you've done it. You've actually completely changed my mind about this, which doesn't happen very often when you get up into the mid 200s of episodes. But
yes.
I want to hear more about this so let's analyze something that I've been going through right now, which is I have found that when I wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and this could be this self-signaling that I'm telling myself this, which is kind of what's putting me over the edge of believing this. But for some reason, when I wake up at 5:30, I feel like I have way more willpower throughout the day, meaning I don't get to the evening and go, okay, I'll have the pita with the shawarma, which I normally kind of am very clear to tell the guy, don't bring it in the bag at all.
Yeah, removing the external trigger, right? Hacking back. That's it.
Exactly. But I find that even if I'm tempted, when I wake up early, and of course, like this is not a clear clinical one variable thing, because when I wake up early, it means that I went to bed early, which means I slept better, which means I had time to meditate in the morning, which does improve my decision-making faculties. It means I did my exercise routine. I did my breathing. So there's a lot happening there, but I wonder, have I just been convincing myself that I have more willpower when I wake up at 5:30?
This is such a great example. I mean, I could not have asked for a better demonstration of exactly this point, because the point I'm trying to make is we have to reimagine our temperament, that we have to get rid of these self-limiting beliefs like I have a short attention span or an addictive personality or a limited willpower, right? All of these are self-limiting beliefs. Asterisks here, if you actually do have some kind of comorbidity like obsessive compulsive disorder, right? There are real clinical pathologies that, would count. But for most of us, the vast majority of us, we don't have a pathology. So in those cases, I believe we need to get rid of those self-limiting beliefs by reimagining our temperament. And what you've done by getting up at 5:30, why do you feel better? Why do you feel like you have more willpower? What you're doing by getting up at 5:30 is reinforcing the belief that you have agency and control over your life. This is the best part about exercise. The best thing about exercise, and this is why exercise, we've seen has profound impact on anxiety disorder, on depression. I don't believe it's actually the exercise itself per se, although there probably are some physiological effects. The real reason that any act that reinforces an identity that I have control. It's called an internal versus an external locus of control. Are things happening to me, or can I affect the world? And so by waking up at 5:30 in the morning, you are reinforcing that you have an internal locus of control, that you can control your world. And that sticks with you throughout the day. That reinforced belief that you are powerful is what makes it so.
I love that, because I have been wondering, so this is perfect timing. And it's just fascinating to me how effective it is. I mean, I'll tell you a story that I think is really interesting. And I've told this a few times, but I think it bears repeating. As we built our memory and learning courses, we started implementing surveying throughout them. And in the first week of the program, we're really just setting you up. You're doing baseline measurements. You're learning a little bit about how the hippocampus works, so on and so forth, right? Background knowledge, getting the learner prepared, same way a college course would be. But we found that in the surveys, people would start saying things like, I can't believe the course is already working. My memory is already improved. And we kind of scratched our heads. We're like, there's literally no way you've learned nothing yet, except for the different parts of the brain, And we reached out and we figured out exactly this. One, people had taken control by enrolling in this course, by doing the first few steps. They now felt like they were in control. And I actually named it the memory Pygmalion effect, which is they were now saying things like, I'm taking a really expensive memory course. My memory is already getting better. And they stopped saying things which we're all guilty of saying. Things like, oh, nice to meet you. Listen, I'm probably going to forget your name. I have a lousy memory.
Yeah, this is a great example, and I don't say this in a derogatory way. This is a placebo effect. But the fact is, placebos are really effective. Placebos work really, really well. So the power of suggestion, when we believe that something will have an effect, it does have an effect. I mean, the placebo effect, there's a great book called Suggestible You that I highly recommend that just blew my mind when it comes to just how powerful the placebo effect is. And we don't really know why it's so effective, but there is incontrovertible evidence that it is incredibly effective. And so we can have these placebo effects on our physical well-being. We can also have these placebo effects on our psychological well-being. And I think that the biggest placebo effect, if you can call it that, it's not really clear if it is or not, is this sense of agency and control. Can I influence my life? Can I have impact around the world around me? I mean, if you think about what depression is characterized by, it's characterized by a sense of hopelessness, that nothing I do matters. It's not even worth getting out of bed for the severe cases because nothing's going to change. And the opposite of that, right? Think about what the opposite of depression, a world where nothing I do matters, is a world where everything I do matters, right? Think about the super powerful executive where, at a signing of a pen or the whatever action they want to take, they have remarkable impact. That turns out to be incredibly empowering when you believe that your behavior changes outcomes. That's incredibly fulfilling, and it increases our sense of well-being.
Wow. Now, I know we're running out of time here and the time has just flown, Nir, but I do want to ask a little bit about how you learn, because I think someone listening in the audience is probably going, this guy has a PhD in psychology. Actually, you have a master's in business. And between A and B, you have self-taught, which I think is just incredible, because I know doctors in psychology and you speak the same lingo. How do you learn? I'll ask it very broadly.
Yeah, I'll let you in on my secret. My secret is to make time to think. That this is the secret that I think people don't know. I haven't heard too many people preach this gospel, but I think that these days we are so reactive, right? Everything we do is about reacting, and we do not make time to reflect. Now, how you make time to think is up to you. For me, in order to think, I need to write. And so I don't write because I have the answers. I write because I want to know the answers. So everything I write is motivated by a question that I have. And part of the reason I didn't go get a PhD, I thought about at one point right after business school about going to get a DBA, but I decided not to, was because I wanted to explore questions that no one else had even a program around, right? At the time, there was no PhD in behavioral design. It still doesn't exist, right? And so I wanted to know things that nobody else was really at the cutting edge of. And so where was I going to get a PhD mentor from? I didn't see which department I would fit into. And even then, right, the goal was so I could answer my questions and learn new stuff and then teach others about it so they can improve their lives. Well, that's essentially what I just started doing. And I think we're seeing this more and more, not just in academia, but in all facets of life, is that today you can be a self-starter in the way you couldn't before. That all the research is out there. I mean, I didn't want to do more, lab type research, because when I started digging into what research has already been done, I found that there's, oodles of research. There's tons of research trapped in the ivory towers that nobody ever reads except for, some academic committee. And so there's tons of research out there. What I think was lacking was the practical application of that research to real world problems. And I think that's my specialty. That's what I really wanted to do, was not so much do the lab research, but figure out how to apply that research to answer my own questions and hopefully help others as well. So I think the secret is no matter what format, for me, it's writing. For someone else, it might be discussing it with someone. It might be, creating some kind of other content, maybe some other, medium. But I think it's really about making time to answer your own questions. We're so quick to, go buy a book to answer your problems, or go listen to some guru, or go buy a course, or go attend a workshop, when really, a lot of our problems, if we just make time to sit and think about the problem, we'll either A, figure out the answers, or B, we'll have a very focused approach as to what it is we actually need answered. And then we can go do specific research to answer that question, which is still left unanswered.
I really like that. And I felt a touch of Richard Feynman in what you were saying.
Yes, he's a hero of mine. Absolutely.
Mine as well. Yeah. And if he wanted to understand something, he'd figure out a way to write about it, teach it, explain it to others, and just sit and think on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think some of the trouble is that we see so many pithy statements, between Twitter and people's blogs. And, my friend Mark Manson recently said something to the effect in one of his pieces of, the kind of stuff you read in a tweet sounds smart, but when you digest that idea long form, you can call out the bullshit. And so it's only by really digesting something, by thinking through it yourself, not just taking it on face value, but starting from first principles and analyzing what it is you want to know. Start with a question, not with the answer. That's the way to discover this kind of truth. And, if you come to a stumbling block and say, oh, you know what, I'm really stuck, you'll have a very specific question. When you have a very specific question, those are relatively easy to answer. You can find an expert. You can find something that's been written about that specific question, as opposed to how do I become happy? Right. Have you sat and thought about that for yourself for a little while and figured out what's keeping you from becoming happy?
It's so true. It's so true. And really, I've kind of found that I can't think with a screen on. I can write with a screen on, which gets some of my best thinking out, but I need to first sit and do the thinking.
Yes.
And it doesn't happen nearly enough, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Nir, we pretty much have burnt through all the time. I do want to ask you, what's next for you? I mean, you're going to obviously tour around with this book. What are you working on after that?
Yeah, so Indestructible will be available September 2019 in the US, and then October in the Commonwealth. And then it'll be published in, I think we have 13 languages that are slated for 2019 and 2020. So I'll be helping to promote Indistractable around the world. And after that's done, I don't know. I'll think of some new questions that I need answered and move on to the next project. But for right now, Indistractable is going to keep me busy for quite a while.
I love that. And I will look forward to interviewing you once again, because I love the way you think. I love the way you answer those questions. And I think they're questions that a lot of us are asking. So, Nir Eyal, it's been an absolute pleasure. We'll go ahead and put links to everything, including your website, which I believe is nearandfar.com.
Right. Yes.
Awesome. So that will all be at superhuman.blog for everyone out there listening. And Nir, before I let you go, I just want to ask, if people take away one big message from this podcast episode and they carry it with them for the rest of their lives, what would you hope for that to be?
Yeah, so the message I would like people to know is that they are more powerful than they believe. That I think the current narrative that we are somehow being controlled by our technology, that it's addicting us, is not true. And it's serving the very companies that we are trying to wean ourselves off using. So the message I want people to know out there is that you are more powerful than you think if you know the right techniques, if you know how to become indistractable. We all have this superpower.
I love that. Fantastic message to end on. Nir Eyal, thank you so much, my friend. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the award-winning Superhuman Academy podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit superhuman.blog. While you're at it, please take a moment to share this episode with a friend and leave us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next week.